Well, I want to welcome everybody as we settle in, and I'm seeing old friends and new friends, and it's just so delightful to welcome you into this virtual space. And this is our 3 times a semester Wednesday event, and we feature scholars and very interesting people always to speak about their passion. And Dr. Arti Dhand, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Toronto, where she also, as I recall, did her PhD, has for years and years been in love with the narratives of the Mahabharata. And the Mahabharata, most of you have studied it, I'm sure, many of you with me, in fact. The Mahabharata is one of the most puzzling, difficult, Shakespearean, Moliere-esque creations in the history of human storytelling. And Arti has brought it into the 21st century. And one of the things that we know about the Mahabharata is that it always finds ways of expression unique to the culture that receives it. So the shadow puppets of Indonesia, the third gender communities of India have lifted up certain stories, particularly, well, it's too much to get into, but there are just so many ways through which the Mahabharata continues after thousands of years to find expression. And the latest is in a podcast. And as soon as this lit up my screen and my earphones, I said, oh, we need to be doing this. And I want Arti to understand that we've landed in our Master of Arts in Yoga Studies into a place where the first year Sanskrit students, and we have 20 plus we have extension students, another 25 extension students. So we have over 40 people learning Sanskrit right now, and they do so with a book put together by Thomas Egenes that uses shlokas from the Bhagavad Gita. So from the very beginning of their first semester, they're getting little pieces of the Mahabharata, and many of them have discovered the new Carol Satyamurti iambic pentameter translation. Some of them have become quite disaffected with Peter Brook. Others have found, of course, the comic books, the animated versions, and it's a continuing discovery and celebration. So I want to thank you, Arti, for joining us tonight and getting that mini update on your 2 sons. And she doesn't have 100 sons. She doesn't have 5 sons, but she has 2 sons, which is double the number of sons that I have. And there's always something that's happening if you have male children as well as female children. But I just wanted to, again, thank you for being here. And we really look forward to sharing your current work.
Thank you. Thank you all for the invitation. Thank you all for coming on Wednesday evening. My 2 sons often feel like 100 sons. So that's there. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to, this is really the first major conversation I'm having about the podcast, which has been a bit of a secretive project from, one corner of my office there. So my talk might be a little bit rambling, reflection of oriented in that way. But I'm very happy to share it with you and to talk about it. So I'm just going to launch into that right away. And I look forward to hearing your questions or comments and engaging whatever ideas you have about it. So, okay, today I'm going to talk about the Mahabharata podcast. I'd like to tell you a little bit about its genesis, its sources of inspiration, the interpretive posture I've assumed in relation to the text, and along the way, raise some questions about the relationship between scholarship and storytelling and about adhikar, or who owns the story. What does it mean to tell it anew, in a new place? Who gets to hear it? So that all surely sounds like scintillating stuff, and hopefully we're going to have some fun along the way. So let's start with the genesis of the Mahabharata text itself. One argument for its composition, as likely many of you know, is that it's a response to a historical crisis. Scholarly consensus has it that it was composed at a time when the Brahmanical tradition or Vedic tradition or ancient Hinduism, call it what we may, felt itself besieged by challenges, among them from new religions like Buddhism and Jainism, all competing for the hearts, minds, and pocketbooks of ancient Indians. Scholars such as Nick Allen, Jim Fitzgerald, Alf Hilterbytel argue that the character of Yudhishthira in particular is intended as a foil to the character of Ashoka, who's constructed in Buddhist tales as the archetypal virtuous king. And in this light, we can also read the Gita as offering its own middle way, a philosophy that honors the responsibilities that we have to family and society while still providing fodder for our soteriological yearnings. So the Mahabharata rarely makes these arguments directly, but rather advances them artfully through story. My takeaway from this sample of one is the highly original insight that crisis breeds creativity. All that is by way of segue to say that if the Mahabharata is a creative response to its historical crises, the Mahabharata podcast was my flailing response to the plague of our times, the pandemic. In my case, there's no originality to speak of. Rather, I see it as one more instance in a 2,000-year history of an individual drawing inspiration and solace from a masterwork that served that function for millennia. In our own time of stress, something about a work in which millions of people butcher each other in ghastly, grisly ways was comforting to me. When the pandemic started, I was teaching a graduate class on the Mahabharata. It was a small group. We were reading through the Adi Parva, or the first book, and having fun passing through it chapter by chapter. Then in March 2020, the lockdown began in Toronto and everything went away. The foreign students dispersed to their home countries, conversations all stopped, and the interlocutors disappeared. Like many of us, I had the unsettling experience of lecturing into a void. The pandemic was also a difficult time for me personally. It was a period of big loss, and I was grieving. Among other things, my mother just passed away, or she'd passed away a short time earlier in Vancouver, not from COVID, but still, she died in a hospital far away from me. I never got to see her. So when the pandemic started, and in its early period, there was story upon story of elderly people dying alone and neglected in hospitals. For me, it was like repressed trauma. And it brought me back to the text that we were reading. As many of you will know, the Mahabharata begins with a bereaved father's anguish. Dhritarashtra's lost all of his children in a stupid war that he could have avoided with a few courageous decisions. But his attachment and weakness for his children was such that he couldn't resist his partiality. His grief creates the aesthetic frame for our text, and the quality of sorrow sort of heaves through 18 volumes. The entire text is, in one dimension at least, an attempt to comprehend what happened, the narrow cause and the larger purpose, the role of one lone individual self, and the role of fate or God or gods or what have you. For me, this immersion in Dhritarashtra's story, which in its fundamentals is also everyone's story, was cathartic. But I also wanted to tell the Mahabharata for other reasons. First of all, everyone was on about Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones. And that was just annoying. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the Game of Thrones. But seriously. More importantly, I knew the text in two ways, and neither of them quite captured it for me. I'd been studying it for 2 decades, largely as a canonical object in a scholarly fashion, asking literary, historical, ethical questions. So that's on one side. And I've also seen dramatic enactments of it, devotionally invested, of which the 90s Indian teleserial may be the most familiar. I felt there was space in between for other kinds of reading. The two approaches, the scholarly on the one hand, the religious on the other, each generate a kind of distance. Hang on, I lost my spot. Okay, each generate a kind of distance that I felt the creative world can bridge. In scholarship, we're reading a text that's already distant from us in historical, geographical, cultural terms. Even for one of South Asian background, it's still a distant cultural object, composed in the language of the elite, reflecting a historical landscape inextricable from national imagination, presupposing an archaic religious culture that's far removed from any contemporary one, even that of Hinduism. Moreover, as scholars, we're specifically called upon to cultivate a cool distance, which is crucial to the work that we do. So that's important, but it's also the case that sometimes we're so lost in the weeds of scholarly questions that we forget to just enjoy the story. So that's on one side. On the other side, in the teleserial and in lived Hindu practice, the text and its characters are rendered distant by reverence. In other words, however much we might inflect and nuance its characters, at the end of the day, this is a sacred work recounting the acts of God, among other things. The Pandavas are not merely characters. In the Indian imaginary, they are ancestors. The Mahabharata is not merely a story, it's the story of us as a people. This frame of national reverence has as inhibiting an effect on our ability to encounter the text as our scholarly posture does in a different way. I wanted to read the text as literature. In my mind, the text didn't need to be sacred in order to be powerful, impactful, enlightening, transformative, for literature already has such potency, or at least potentially has such potency. In fact, I felt reverence encumbers our ability to appreciate the messy human content of the story. The text, as we receive it, is overladen, at least the way that that's how it feels to me. It's overladen with the discourse of dharma. Everything's about dharma. Why does Gandhari blindfold herself? Pativrata dharma. Why does Yayati sleep with Sarmishta? Dharma. Really? Dharma? Why does Yudhishthira gamble? Likely some dharmic mystery waiting to be unraveled. Why is Krishna absent from key scenes? Perhaps some manner of prior dharmic commitment? Well, maybe. I felt the overweening religious cast of the text strips it of its emotional valences, its psychological complexity, and handicaps us from relating to the characters as people. Furthermore, and this was really important to me, it forbids us from laughter. One of my personal reservations about the sacred anywhere is its solemnity. We can't laugh. The sacred is serious stuff. We should shush and sit quietly and contemplate. But the Mahabharata is rowdy, chaotic, in my view, filled with humor. This is a quality I cherish and see as the intimate cousin of joy. Everywhere we've got characters doing ridiculous things, foolish, sometimes brave, sometimes tragically idiotic. So Uttanka blowing into a horse's behind, Parikshit sitting on a pillar hiding from a snake, Sarmishta and Devyani's mean girls routine, Sarmishta pushing Devyani into a well, Devyani demanding Sarmishta as a slave, Sarmishta then seducing Devyani's husband, while poor Yayati is shoving his children off, terrified that his wife will find out of his little escapade on the side. So this is brilliant. This is brilliantly comic stuff. What about Devyani's father, who's munching on the remains of his students, ground up like pepper onto his salad? The saga of Vishwamitra and Vishishta, where, let's just think about it, they're fighting over a cow. The ridiculous feud between Drona and Drupad, literally launching wars. Kadru and Vinita betting their freedom on the color of a horse's tail. And why can't anyone just have an ordinary pregnancy? Satyavati, who delivers the same day, Gandhari, who carries for 2 years, KLM's wife, who carries for 12 years. And what about Vasu? How much do you love this story? Vasu carefully collecting his vital essence onto a leaf, which he consigns then to a homing pigeon who gets attacked by another pigeon, whereupon the precious substance, carefully rolled onto a leaf, falls into the water, is swallowed by a fish, and we can go on and on. You can't make this stuff up, and you have to have some. I mean, it's so much fun, and I didn't feel like the current ways of thinking about the text were really allowing us to do that. Classical Indian aesthetics sees the text as reflecting the entire kaleidoscope of emotional experience, and I wanted to resist the reception history that prioritizes discourses of dharma and God, to the detriment of sometimes hilariously human dimensions of the story. I mean, it's a long tale. There's lots of room for dharma and God. We don't need to read the entire thing that way. So to the extent that there was any conscious project, which is not very far at all, mostly I was going on sheer blind instinct. Those are some of the loose impulses that nudged me forward. I thought to tell this story Scheherazade style, as she tells stories, taking 1001 nights to do it, a bit at a time, laughing one day, in sorrow the next, immersed in love and hope and tragedy and loss, one day finding wisdom, the next day letting it slip. I'd have liked to tell two or three stories a week. But as it turns out, podcasting takes work. So unless the stars align in a different way, once a week is about what we've got. So that much about the genesis of the idea. Let's say a few words about the mechanics. It seems To talk about ideas, you need to get your hands dirty with some material work. Immediately, I'd formulated the sankalp, I ran into trouble. First, the world had run out of microphones. At least in Toronto, there was not one to be found. Apparently, I was not unique in thinking about a podcast. Though, to be fair, I did get mine off the ground the week before Michelle Obama, though she likely had better tech support. My tech staff of one, which is to say me, had a dismal level of skill. But it was pandemic and desperate times, and 36 episodes in, if you're still hearing fluctuations in volume and crackling sounds, you know it's because we're still working the same minimalist staff of one. A third impediment for me was the neurotic academic aspiration to perfection. What I could manage was just so far away from perfection, as loving family was not shy to point out. Early consensus was that I sounded like a pipsqueak. My younger spawn offered helpfully that I needed to drop some bass into it, but then lost interest trying to tutor me into how I do that. So the question was, go live as a pipsqueak or first do a year of voice training? If you've heard the podcast, you know the answer to that question, with my apologies. Now about the story I was going to tell. The conceit was that I was going to tell the whole story and nothing but the story. But how do you do that? As I found out very quickly, storytelling is a highly personal thing. Short of simply reading the text aloud, it was always going to be an interpretation. Even in reading, of course, we inflect meaning through voice and intonation. So what principles were going to guide my interpretation? I didn't spend too much time thinking about this, or I would have talked myself out of it. To my mind, the microphone was an extension of my classroom. And in the act of teaching, you're always inevitably engaged in some measure of self-disclosure. You can't avoid revealing who you are, but generally you don't worry about it. You leave that analysis to your students who'll grumble behind your back, write reviews on Facebook, or rate your dress sense on myhorribleprofessor.com, which domain is up for grabs, by the way, if anyone's inclined. But I knew there were at least a few principles that were important to me. I wanted to tell the story following the sequence of the text, with no deviation from beginning to end. I think we can all agree this is a foolhardy undertaking. It's a very large text that's driven many a better scholar to drink. So it's like tempting fate. Life is perilous, punctuated by grand ambitions subsequently recanted, accompanied by public ignominy and humiliation. But I felt I had to give it a shot. Most people who know the story know the salacious bits. It's the tale of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the gambling match, Draupadi and her 5 husbands, Krishna, the Gita, the war, and then question mark. I wanted to tell the story as the text tells it, which is to say, with all the digressions and the tangents that seem to be tucked in with only the most tortured logic. Why? Well, a few reasons. First, 2 centuries of scholarship have been second-guessing the text. Is it really about dharma, artha, kama, moksha as it claims, or is it just a heroic text with vast overlays of religious, philosophical, moralistic, legalistic mumbo-jumbo? Who are the real heroes? Was it really about the Pandavas as it claims, or was it actually about the Kauravas? Maybe it was the Panchalas. No, wait, maybe it was the Vrishnis. Well, maybe, though I have my doubts. but I wanted to give the text the benefit of the doubt, even just as a thought experiment. This is a text that survived, thrived, and persevered close on 2 millennia with at least the bulk of its current features intact. I didn't feel like I could improve upon that. What if I stupidly excised some section that the generation coming behind me was going to show was actually indispensable to interpreting the tale? As a storyteller, you're in some sense a custodian of the text. And you have to at least try to tell it with some faithfulness to its received form. Or so I say now, though in a minute you see I'll be backpedaling. The second reason was that when we cherry pick sections, the practice distorts our reading of its contents. We tend to misinterpret or overinterpret phenomena. For example, most of us have read the Gita before we've read the text. This stands to reason. It's short and pithy and brilliant, so we embroider it with some context. It's a tale of cousins, we say, fighting over an ancestral lands, and we start reading. But unless we're careful, that leads to problematic interpretations. As a graduate student, I remember reading a work where the author argues that the Gita can be used to justify heinous crimes. It's not really you who's killing. There's not really anyone dying. Nayam hanti nahanyate. So just go ahead and hack up people with abandon. Well, that sounds terrible if we don't have a lot of prior context, which is, first, that all of book 5 that precedes the book of the Gita, all of book 5 is about good faith efforts to avoid war. Second, that the Pandavas have tried all the basic ways of achieving conciliation, whatever those might be: negotiation, reducing demands, creating dissension, bribery, hiring prostitutes, blackmail, threats to life and property, who knows. Krishna himself has gone on their behalf on an embassy of peace and been rejected. So when we arrive at the battlefield of Kurukshetra, at the start of the Gita, it's only after we've exhausted all other options. So at that point, for Arjuna to run away is a dereliction of duty. So to wrestle properly with the story, we need the full context. Otherwise, we're wrestling phantoms. We don't have to agree with the decisions taken, even by Krishna. There's lots of room there for debate. But at the very least, it behooves us to try to get the full picture to the extent that that's possible. Finally, I was curious to see where this process would take us. I've read the Mahabharata before a few times. Most times I've glossed over sections. For example, there's only so much a single human being can take before plucking her eyelids off, of how the earth is like a bride dressed in the blood of those fallen heroes, or of how his headless torso lay in the dust, his entrails picked apart by hungry vultures, or of how his bowels are splattered everywhere, previously sinewed arms now shredded and festering, chest riddled with worms, or how the women are running around in disarray trying to assemble body parts like a massive jigsaw puzzle. If you're following the podcast, and if I last that long, 5 volumes of such joy awaits you. I've also yawned my way through the 3,000 some sermons of the Anushasana Parva. Sometimes I've been so frustrated with the Adi Parva, with its flying horses and bull excrement, that I've wanted to fling it against the wall. This time, I wanted to try suspending disbelief, to see the world from the other side. What brilliant insights have I gleaned? Let's have that conversation in a few years. Now, in the process of bridging distance, I found myself contemporizing the text. This wasn't a plan, but now I can't see how else it might have been, at least for me. Some of my favorite hymns from the Rig Veda are the hymns to the dawn. They speak of how the dawn ushers in a new day every day, but every day is the same. Whether we're in 1000 BCE or 2000 CE, the basics of being haven't changed all that much. We're not riding horses, we're riding cars. We're not in chariots, we're in tanks. The enemy is different, but is still never wholly other, is still always akin to ourselves. We're still in messy relationships. There are still nerdy, cerebral types who are knowledgeable, but also arrogant and pompous. There are still those who control the use of force, but abuse their monopoly of power to perpetrate unprincipled violence. So I felt like we can read this story in any time, in any day, and today is not all that much different from yesterday times 2000 or what have you. Now, as a scholar, this rejigging of time is a risky exercise because it's not obvious that your audience can tell when you're riffing on the story and when you're telling the story from the text itself. But as a storyteller, it's quintessential Mahabharata MO, what David Herman calls polychronic narration. That is, looping erratically between past, present, future, and the primeval past in vertigo-inducing ways. So as a scholar, I worry about my class listening to the podcast before we've covered that section of the text. On the other hand, if you heard the podcast and are doubtful whether the god Brahma really dispenses boons in his pajamas, and you dive into the text in order to challenge me, my work is done. Now, there are some thorny questions that we have to that emerge from this new telling or this new reading of the text, and one of those that I've had to engage with is that of adhikar or entitlement. Who owns this story? Is it an exclusively Indian story? Is it a violation to universalize it, to change its frame of reference from archaic Indian pastoralism to address a global audience? This is an interesting one. On the one hand, I'm conscious of India's claim on the Mahabharata as a story of itself, a precious heritage informing Indian social, cultural, religious ideals. As a South Asian, I'm privileged to participate in that heritage. Nor can we deny that power and privilege have led to the pillage of cultural treasures around the world, which are then treated with cavalier ignorance and disrespect. On the other hand, no culture is a silo. The history of the world is one of lively cultural exchange, and the flow of art and knowledge is ever dynamic and dialogic, full of difficult questions and negotiations. So from my point of view, if you're interested in the subject, are willing to wrestle with its challenges, the challenges it will pose for you, which sometimes will expose your own presumption and privilege, you're welcome in my classroom. There's also other tricky turf that I'm still working out. For example, our text is replete with noxious discourses about class. Entire segments of humanity are subject to the control of others, And our text is deeply invested in maintaining a stratification of society that most of us find abhorrent today. The impulse is to look away and to deny it. But there's a moral imperative not to. We're not quite there yet in our telling in the podcast, so I'm not quite sure how we'll tackle that question. But what I do know is we can't erase the ugly prejudices of our text. So let's see how that goes. Finally, this was always, inevitably, unavoidably going to be a feminist reading. How could it not be? I mean, who can take seriously statements that say you should treat your husband as a god? What man today can make such a statement with a straight face? Okay, maybe I'll let that go. I see the Mahabharata equally as a book about women. They get less airtime, to be sure, but the breadcrumbs of their lives are everywhere if we want to gather them up into stories. So let's think about some of these women who, who we've already encountered and a couple whom we haven't. Let's think about Gandhari. She's one of our most fascinating characters. I see her in her childhood as a girl of towering idealism and ambition who ends up married to a blind man without any discussion with her, without any consultation with her. And for whatever complex of reasons, she blindfolds herself for life. Speaking of grand commitments that you're then beholden to carrying out day after day for the rest of your life. She's blessed with 100 sons that she first can't deliver, then she can't see, who then turn out to be wayward miscreants, who then die, all of them, in a terrible war, while she and her blind husband are still standing many years later. How much tragedy can you accommodate in one life? Let's think about Kunti. She's donated by her father to his cousin, assigned then by her adoptive father to serve a cranky old holy man like Rishi Durvasa, whose ferocious temper makes the likes of even Ram and Lakshman in the Ramayana tremble. She's pressured as a naive teen into sex by a powerful figure like Surya. She's married to King Pandu, who also then takes another apparently hotter, younger, sexier wife. She married a king, but he shortly thereafter renounces his kingdom for a life of hardship in the Himalayas. Did he ask his wives if they wanted to eat weeds for the rest of forever? No. Then he gets cursed for his violent indulgence of hunting animals for sport, becoming, for all intents and purposes, infertile, and she's left to save the bloodline, sleeping with 3 different men to have 3 children. Then shortly thereafter, she becomes a widow on account of her husband's inability to resist her rival wife's sexual charms. Now she's the single mother of 5 boys, all set to grow up as the poor cousins in their father's ancestral home that should have been theirs. She's got an elder son born of what today we'd call date rape, whom she had to abandon, who now hates her. And finally, when the Pandavas get their own kingdom, which her bright and shiny eldest son then gambles away. After 13 years of exile, the other guys refuse to give the kingdom back, and then her sons are like, maybe we don't need to fight. Maybe we can settle this in some other way. Maybe we'll just go off into the forest. Fighting is so violent. You even have Bhima saying, well, maybe war is a terrible thing. Violence is a terrible thing. We shouldn't fight. This is Kunti's lot in life. Let's talk about Amba, who's one of my favorite characters of all time. Kidnapped at her wedding when she's already in love with another man. She boldly speaks up for herself to Bhishma, who gives her permission to leave, but now her lover rejects her as spoiled goods and for fear of her kidnapper. So she goes back to Bhishma and demands that he do the honorable thing and marry her. But he refuses, telling her to go back to her father. Now she's punted around from one man to another, and she has to decide what she's going to do. She reflects on the cause of her problems, determines that of all the men in her life who've treated her like chattel, Bhishma's caused her the greatest harm. But he's feared and powerful, and she can't find a champion who'll hold him effectively accountable. So she herself starts practicing tapas. In her next life, she's going to be reborn as a man, and she herself is going to kill Bhishma. But she's in a hurry to do this. So what does she do? She kills herself and is reborn then to King Drupad as what will eventually be Draupadi's sister. But to really muck things up, adding insult to injury, she now has no memory of her past grudge. She's been reborn to avenge herself against Bhishma, but she can't actually remember hating him. How annoying is that? But her parents were expecting a boy. So they dress her. She's born a girl the second time around. She's born as Drupad's daughter. She's born a girl, but her parents are expecting a boy. So they dress her up as a boy, rear her as a boy, even go so far as to get her married as a boy to a girl. On her wedding night, she finally freaks out and runs away from home in panic. Then she's crying in the forest. A tree spirit feels sorry for her and exchanges sex with her. And now now he returns to her, now his wedding chamber, just in time for his bride to confirm that he is in fact a man. And this man now is going to be the shield Arjuna will keep before him so he can kill his grandfather, Bhishma. How brilliant a story is that? So we've got a lot to work with here that calls for interpretation. For example, around questions of what constitutes heroism. Our text gestures toward, but then rather neglects what we might call the daily heroism of women. We can all recount with horror the sexual assault of Draupadi, but we speak less of her isolation, her betrayal, not merely by Yudhishthira in the infamous dice game, but by all of her 5 husbands who each have other wives. So if you're the wife of 5 men who each have other women on the side, who do you have? They all have you, but you have exclusive claim to no one. This strikes me as an unspoken solitude embedded in Draupadi's story. She has 5 sons. She's going to lose them all. Her great solace is that she's the chief queen of her husbands. But her bloodline is going to die. The lineage will survive not through her, but through her rival co-wife, Subhadra, who's the beloved of the husband that she loves the most, Arjuna. What does that feel like? The Mahabharata tells us very little about the emotional lives of its characters. But as the podcast has evolved, it's given me an opportunity to think about them. However, idiosyncratically, it's allowed me to knit together past and present, sacred and profane, the heavenly and the earthly, the east and the west. Whether I'm doing this well or whether I'm doing it poorly is a question for myhorribleprofessor.com. But for me, it's been a joy. It's been a privilege and it's been a solace. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you all for listening.
Bravo.
Thank you.
So energizing. And yeah, I'd like to open it to questions, but I'm going to start with a question. And my question is, I'd love to hear a little bit about Vidura.
About Vidura. The man or the woman? I'm assuming we're going with the man.
Yeah, we'll start with the man.
He's a really interesting character. I'm going to do something more on him as we get into book 5. No, well, book 3 or book 5. So he's very understated right off the bat. He's a little bit neglected, but he's so deeply engaged in the action right from the beginning. So he's guiding the Pandavas all the way along. He's trying to guide the Kauravas, but to no avail. One of the most interesting things about him is his relationship with his brother Dhritarashtra. So Dhritarashtra, on the one hand, so Vidura is a sort of subaltern character. He has no grandstanding. He's equivalent, you might say, to the prime minister, but easy to disregard socially. But on the other hand, he has great influence, great rapport with his brother Dhritarashtra, who leans on him tremendously and also has great love for him. So that's one side of it. That's one dimension, this brotherly bond. And then Vidura is also unique in some sense in being among, maybe there are 2 or 3 characters in the entirety of the Mahabharata who actively aspire to freedom, to mukti, and achieve it. So that's going to make a fascinating study. So one of the things that I've been trying to do, and as we get further on, maybe even at the end, to do entire character profiles, pulling together the little strains of what we have in different parts of the text. And Vidura is going to be one of those characters who's on the one hand socially not maligned exactly, but neglected. So, for example, there's a scene in the 5th book where Vidura clearly has possesses all the highest knowledge, but he's not allowed to communicate it. So, in book 5, Dhritarashtra is appealing for some sort of higher discourse. Vidura could provide it, but on the other hand, he outsources that to Sanat Sujata, another sage, a Brahmin sage, who's then going to give this discourse about freedom, about liberation. So, Vidura, what do you think, Chris?
I think he's unheralded, and I think I really look forward to the way that you bring him into people's awareness. So I want to make space for other people and love to hear some questions about Draupadi, Kunti, but please unmute yourself and let your voice be heard.
I just want to say I really love the podcast. I love your presentation, your humor. It's a pure joy to listen to, and the cherry on top is the musical transitional edits that I find myself kind of dancing to as I'm walking my dog and things. Was that just a serendipitous choice that happened to work out great, or was that something you always thought you wanted, or how did that work in the production of the podcast?
You're being very generous in calling it production. It's I wanted music that on the one hand was upbeat. The percussive beat was very important to me because that's how I feel about it. I approach it as I see it as a source of joy, and to some sense, in some sense, the music should reflect that. But I also wanted it to reflect the sort of grandeur and solemnity, the vast tableau that the Mahabharata is dealing with. So how did I find that? I'm not even sure. I think I was just on one of these sites where you can buy music, little scraps of music, and I listened to, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 tracks, and that's what the percussion is stomp, right? So yeah, thank you. And thank you for your kind words. That's lovely. You're always talking into a vacuum, right? You don't know who's listening. You don't know if anyone's listening. You don't know what they're thinking. And every so often you'll get a little something back from the universe saying, asking a question. And then, oh, okay, there is someone out there. But really, I mean, you're talking into a void. So the feedback is fantastic. Thank you. Okay.
Okay, Sandra, do you have something that you'd like to just ask about the Mahabharata? You have a world expert here, and this is your opportunity.
I'm sorry, Dr. Chappell, are you calling on me? I just wanted to say how much I love the podcast. I've been listening to it back to back, and really, I love the humor that you bring into it, because sometimes these stories are pretty outrageous, and you do have to while you're reading it, you're trying to understand it, and sometimes it's hard to stand back and just go, wait a minute, are they really just doing that? So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. If you start reading the Mahabharata, one of the things about doing this podcast is, if you start reading the Mahabharata just off the street, students often come say, I'm fascinated with the story. I've heard it in childhood, etc. So they come to it eager to learn. You crack the spine of the Adi Parva, and 3 chapters in, you want to shoot yourself, because it's convoluted, it's dense, it's just all over the place. And the Mahabharata doesn't make it easy. It doesn't connect the dots. It starts practically every second chapter starts complete non sequiturs, and you don't know what are you supposed to do with this. Just these random stories, and somewhere do they make any sense? What's it all about? And so part of I mean, probably I couldn't have done this 10 years ago, but part of having been immersed in it for all of this time is to be able to connect those dots for people, and to be able to shed, to trim some of the excess stuff that I don't think we absolutely need to appreciate the story, and to appreciate the beauty of the story, the complexity of the story, the complexity of the characters, and also the great philosophical wisdom of the story. So that's kind of, in some sense, what I've been pruning the text a little bit, and it's been kind of fun. I haven't gotten into any serious trouble yet. That could still happen. Every so often I worry about it, but something's going to. That's how it is.
I particularly like your rating system about whether you need to remember a person or not.
Right, thank you. You know what? I was thinking about that the other day. I kind of forgot about that somewhere along. I lost that somewhere along the way. Maybe I need to recover it again. But after a while, some characters are so familiar, you just start rolling with the story. So, yeah, thank you.
Patrick, it
really is a cast of thousands and thousands, right? How are you going to remember all that?
Yeah. So Patrick, do you have a question about a central character?
Well, I suppose it would be lovely to hear you say more about the figure of Draupadi, and particularly thinking about her in relationship to, say, the dramatic contrast between her and Sita in Ramayana. So contemporary, in teaching the text and looking at some of the feminist interpretations of Sita, and there's a rich array of things one can say and have been said about Sita. What would be your take about how Draupadi is received by contemporary audiences in terms of being another kind of model, in the contemporary culture? She gaining some ground, or is she really not moving into the foreground in that kind of way?
Contemporary culture is a harder one for me to address than talking about the two characters textually. There are quite a few artistic works that build on the narrative of Draupadi. There have been, this has been the case for some time now. So Draupadi is on the one hand seen as this strong, this powerful, assertive female character, and that comes across in quite a bit of the fictional writing of this generation, in both in English and in some vernacular languages. I personally see her more. I see her vulnerability more than her. So she comes across in many scenes, of course. What we remember about her, the whole thing where I'm not going to wash my, I won't dress my hair until it's been washed in the blood of this man who defiled me. That passion, that sense of indignation, of outrage. So that's one side of her. On the other side of her, there's a whole, there's so much vulnerability there, where I really feel like she's lost. She's lost among all of these other characters who depend upon her, who build upon her role in the text as the center of these five men, holding these five men together. She's the goddess. She's an incarnation of the goddess. All of that. But on the other hand, what's she got at the end of the day? What is she? Her life, in so many respects, ends up just tragic. I would say lonely, and neglected, abused. So I see Draupadi as a much more complex character um, than a lot of the traditional readings of her. In relation to Sita is a brilliant character as well. And my current work, to be finished sometime before, I don't know, the end of time or something, is a comparative reading of the two texts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And in one chapter, I'm arguing that Valmiki is more writing Sita's story than Rama's story, in some sense. The vantage point he's putting forward from the beginning and at the end is that of Sita rather than of Ram. He's the one who's taken in this woman after she was dumped, after she was abandoned, pregnant, in the forest, left out in the wild. He took her into his ashram. He reared her children. He trained her children. He taught her children the story of themselves. He sent her children out to perform in front of their father. And in the end, it's he who brings Sita out before Ram at the last sacrifice, where she says, where she disappears into the earth again. Did he know she was going to do that? That we don't know. But I see, I see the Ramayana much more in some sense, or at least as much. The Valmiki Ramayana is written from subversively from the perspective of Sita rather than of Ram. I think I took that in directions maybe that
that was great. Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah,
very
thanks.
helpful.
But two really quite brilliant women, so much depth and complexity and so much there to think about and unpack.
Thank you.
Yes, Ayana.
Hi, yes, I just have a quick question. With the text, I know that there are a number of interpretations, variations. Are there a couple of versions that you, I guess, lean towards the most or like the most? Just in terms of variation, story, like what do you, I guess, who are your go-to texts and versions?
In terms of what is it that I read and rely on mostly for my scholarship sort of default text, I tend to work with the critical edition, just because it seems to be, it's largely, I mean, there's a long process that's gone into assembling that. And you got to start somewhere. And I think, so that's a text, that's the text basically that I go with. It's not always clear. There are certainly others that shed light on certain scenes more than the critical edition will. So for example, the Vastraharan, the Draupadi's disrobing scene in the assembly in the second book. Is Krishna there? Is he not there? What is that miracle that she doesn't get stripped bare naked? Is Krishna at work there? Is that the work of Krishna? Later on, she'll say in book 3, you weren't there. And he'll seem to acknowledge, you're right, I wasn't there. I was actually doing this other thing, etc. So it doesn't answer all the questions, whereas some other versions do. But that's the text that I tend to work with, is the critical edition. I don't tend to favor the abridged version so much because I like to see the stuff in the middle. So most of the abridged, I mean, obviously you need abridged versions of the text, because who's going to go out there and read 18 volumes, a lot of which is really, stuff that you absolutely never wanted to read in your life, about the importance of, I don't know, I mean, of course, the importance of digging wells and planting trees, all of that is great stuff. But how many times do you need to read that? How many chapters do you need of it? All that kind of thing. So I don't know where I was going with that. I think I was saying the importance of abridged versions. I find that a lot is lost in excising parts of the text. So the abridged versions tend to prioritize the narrative or the dominant narrative, whereas in my reading, I find that the secondary narratives shade our understanding or interpretation of what's happening in the dominant narrative. So I find just reading through the Adi Parva, most of the Adi Parva is not about the Pandavas at all, or the Kauravas, the Pandavas. Most of the Adi Parva has all kinds of extraneous materials. You're wondering, what's this doing here? But it's the setup for the text, and it provides a lot, it tells us what the text is concerned with, what are the big themes it's pondering, what's happening in the in the realm of the gods, this sort of thing. And so I like to see the big, the whole thing, the big thing from, I want that large vantage point. So yeah. So I tend to work with the critical edition. That's the long answer.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question.
Hi.
Please.
And yes, thank you so much for the great presentation. I love it so much. Thank you so much. And I'm surprised the wives or women, their opinion and thoughts are so respected in the Mahabharata. I always compare it to my own culture. I'm from Japan, and usually the women's, the wives of the king or that kind of the man of the position, the good wife is basically smiling silently in his side. That is a good wife. But in the Mahabharata, like Draupadi, she sometimes said some opinion to her husbands, and it's like a secretary. So what was the role of the wives in that era?
There's so much packed in there. So first I want to say on the question of what's the era, I'm going to say this is all literature, and I don't know that there was that the text is actually representative in any accurate way of a historical era. So setting that aside, what's the role of women? What does the text want of women? The text wants of women, at least in some dimensions, what you're saying, Japanese culture, at least as you set it forth, wants of women. Mostly wants them to be quiet, mostly wants them to support, to be the support system for their husbands, mostly wants them to commit all of life and resources and everything to the success and prosperity of their husbands. This kind of thing. So you have Draupadi, for example, in the third book. She's going to give this long sermon about the duties of a woman, of a wife, what a wife should be like, this kind of thing. On the other hand, the women of the Mahabharata are willful. They are, even while overtly parroting the ideology, a very conservative patriarchal ideology. So Draupadi herself will say, you need to worship your husband as a god. My husband is like a god to me, or my husbands are like gods to me, etc. So she'll say all this sort of stuff. On the other hand, she won't have any problem whacking them around. I mean, verbally, from time to time, and she suddenly expresses herself. And if we've as I myself am discovering more through the process of this closer reading than I'm used to in the podcast, that women find ways of making their presence known and making of accomplishing their desires and accomplishing their will. So I love the story of Sarmishta and Devyani and Yayati in the middle. So there are these two really quite powerful women, both of whom want different things, and they've got this man in the middle, and there's a little tug of war happening. He, for all intents and purposes, he's the king, he's lord and master, but in fact, he's being manipulated this way and that way, and he's petrified that he's going to get into trouble. So there's a lot of that happening in that story. The story that I did just this last week was of Ulupi, who basically jumps on Arjuna saying, make love to me, and then gives him all the reasoning why he should neglect his commitment to remain celibate during the years. It gives him this sophistical reasoning. So women are willful. They are sexual. They're assertive, and if they can't be that way directly in certain situations, they find ways. They find ways to at least make their perspective heard, make their perspective understood. I find this about Gandhari, for example. For the most part, she's silent through the text. She talks very little. She shows up in different places, etc. But her presence, just the very fact, I mean, just think about it, it just blows my, I've read this text, I've known this story pretty well my entire life. I've read this text many times before, and you think, okay, so she blindfolds herself. This is like a crazy thing to do, a really brilliant, amazing, powerful thing to do. But okay, so she blindfolds herself. And I started thinking, what does it mean to blindfold yourself? Right? You take a strip of cloth, you put it around your eyes. What must be the temptation every single day to look? I mean, this is voluntary blindness. What must be the temptation to I mean, surely you're washing it from time to time, you're bathing, you go year on year wearing a blindfold, and she's choosing this actively all the time. It's not like she made this decision once and that's it, now she's blind. No, she's choosing this every single day. And so women have this extraordinarily powerful will. Many of them do, and they make. When I did the episode on Gandhari, I spent some time thinking about what is it that would make a woman. A woman who seems to have this kind of background, who just voluntarily blind herself. And it seemed to me like she's making many kinds of statement. On the one hand, maybe it's a statement of virtue. On the other hand, maybe it's a statement of, it's a sort of it's an aggressive act. So yeah, let's be rambling. There's so much we can say about women in this text. I find the more I read it, they keep creeping out from, in ways that I hadn't expected. So in a few years, we can have a much more dynamic conversation about women.
Thank you so much.
So I want to not keep you up too much later. She's all the way on the other side of the country, so it's actually very, very late. But I wanted to close with asking you two questions. for which hopefully you will have short responses. The first is why the Mahabharata for you? And second, at what pace or when do you think you will be able to complete the podcast?
Okay. The first question about the Mahabharata, why the Mahabharata? I think it's my background as an undergraduate was in history and in literature. And I did my master's in religion, and the Mahabharata pulls it all together. So it's history, it's literature, it's philosophy, it's religion, it's all of that. And what more can you ask for? It's a story you can drown in forever and ever. So there's that. And then the second question, I don't know. I thought I'd be finished the Adi Parva in 20 episodes. Now I think it's going to be about 38. We're almost done. So I think it's going to be years. I think it's going to be years.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to jump in and join me or, to speed the process up, I'm here. I'll take it.
Well, that's a challenge to all of these fine folks who tuned in tonight.
It's an invitation.
Invited to make suggestions, and this new world of email and easy access is just so remarkable. But we're so much enjoying this new endeavor on your part, and we're so delighted that you were able to join us this evening. So
thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.